Cyclops Baitfish is a multi-purpose baitfish pattern that slides through snags easily and can be made to sink at varying rates depending on the bead used. I've been tying it for over 25 years, initially with lead eyes. At some point, I tried a brass bead in place of the lead eyes, and much prefer the shape and action a bead gives. The fly is a combination of Craycraft's Epoxy Zonker and a Clouser Minnow, with a bead substituted for the lead eyes. I use beads which I painted with eyes. I paint a bunch at once, so I always have some ready. If you want to give it a try, we have a short video on how to do it. Start off by sliding a bead onto the hook shank. Then clamp the hook in your vise. With the bead back towards the bend, start the thread a little way behind the eye of the hook. Cut off the tag end of the thread. Cover this area with a layer of thread, then work back up towards the eye, moving the thread up to where you want the front of the bead to stop. Then slide the bead into place up against the thread. The bead should sit about 1/3 of the hook shank behind the eye. Lash the bead in place with crossing wraps over the side of the bead closest to the hook point, and locking wraps around the hook shank both in front of and behind the bead. If you painted on eyes, make sure the eyes are oriented correctly. All the crossing wraps should be on what will be the top of the finished fly, pushing the bead away from the hook point towards what will be the belly. Put a few locking wraps directly behind the bead, followed by a half hitch. Then wrap towards the back of the hook, continuing a little way around the bend. Wrapping around the bend will give the belly a more rounded shape. Lock the thread in place with a half hitch. Cut a piece of Mylar tubing with the core removed to about 1.5 times the length of the hook. A little longer is fine. Tie it in on the side of the hook opposite the point, with around half a hook gap length hanging off the end. Make the tie-in point as small as possible. Fold the Mylar back and place a few wraps directly in front, then over the folded back Mylar. Finish with the thread a few wraps in front of the Mylar. Tie in some sparkle braid by the end, wrapping back to just in front of the Mylar tubing. Leave the sparkle braid and Mylar hanging, and wind the thread all the way up to just behind the bead. Tie a half hitch to secure the thread. Wind the sparkle braid up the body in close wraps, covering the hook shank up to the bead. Bring the thread around and over a couple times to lock the braid in. Trim the excess. Then wrap down any loose ends. Tie a whip finish right against the back of the bead. Bring the thread in front of the bead, crossing over the bead on the side nearest the hook point, and lock the thread in place with a half hitch. Now it's time to form the belly. Rotate the hook so it's point down. Bring the Mylar tubing up and over the bead, forming a rounded belly. Make 1 or 2 loose thread wraps around the Mylar just in front of the bead, and pull the thread snug but not completely tight. Adjust the belly by shortening or lengthening the Mylar. Lock the tubing in place once you have the shape you want. Trim off the tag end of the Mylar. Then bind the butt ends down to the hook shank. Try not to build up too much thread. Whip finish, and trim the thread. The next step is to build the body using UV resin. In this case, I'm using Solarez UV resin. I'll start with a medium viscosity, covering the sparkle braid and filling the gap between the hook shank and the Mylar belly. Cure this layer with the UV light. Having the right light for the resin you're using is important. Resins are made to cure at different wavelengths, and the wrong UV light will leave the resin only partly cured. Continue building the body using thin resin. Add more little by little, creating the shape you want as you go. Fill in gaps, cover the bead, especially if you painted eyes on it, and coat the Mylar tubing. Try not to get any resin on the thread in front of the bead. If you get too much resin on the fly, you can remove some with a bodkin or toothpick, or, if using a squeeze bottle, use the bottle to suction the excess back in. When you're ready, cure the resin with the UV light. Solarez dries completely with no sticky residue. Others may need to be cleaned off with an alcohol wipe or coated with head cement to get rid of the sticky film. Now that the body is done, it's time to add the wing. Start the thread in front of the body, finishing with the thread a few wraps in front of the bead. Cut off the tag end of the thread. Trim a clump of white bucktail. I prefer long, straight, fine hairs for this fly. Remove the short hair and stack the clump. I don't worry about getting it perfect. I want the final thickness to be about the thickness of a No. 2 pencil lead when compressed. Measure the bucktail clump against the hook. I want a length of about twice the hook length to extend past the tie-in point. Start with a couple loose wraps. Pull the wraps tight while holding the bucktail together right on top of the hook. Try to keep all the hairs directly on top of the hook without bunching up on one side. Continue wrapping, being careful not to use too much tension near the bead, which would cause the hairs to flare. Finish with the thread a little way behind the eye of the hook. Pick the butt ends up and trim them short enough that they won't stick out over the eye of the hook. Add a few strands of flash, folding them over the thread at the midpoint and sliding them into place. If necessary, trim them to the length of the longest bucktail or a little longer. Now, cut off a clump of tan bucktail and clean and stack it. This clump should be a little thicker than the first clump. Measure against the white bucktail, evening the tips up, and tie it in. Hold the bucktail firmly in place with one hand, using the other to make a couple of loose wraps around the hook shank. Make sure the material is where you want it. Pinch the bucktail in place firmly with your materials hand and use your thread hand to pull the wraps tight. Continue wrapping to fix the bucktail in place. Trim the butt ends. Tie them down, forming a smooth thread head. Then whip finish. And trim the thread. Seal the thread wraps with UV resin or regular head cement. Ultra-thin resins, like Solarez Bone Dry or Loon Flow, are easy to apply, penetrate well, make a durable finish, and dry in seconds. If you have a hair or two at odd angles, you can trim it off short or just break it off with a sharp tug. Use your bodkin to pick out the individual strands of the Braid and Mylar tubing. I tie the fly in different colors and sizes, varying the bead size and material, as well as the body shape, to change both the profile and the sink rate. In some of the variations, I'll add a rattle inside a length of medium Mylar tubing. I keep a box of finished bodies or blanks ready to go. Then just add the wing when I need more flies. Because it catches such a wide variety of fish in both fresh and saltwater, this is one of a few patterns that I always have with me in some variation. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more like it, please subscribe.